The forgotten coastal village of Saltmere clung to cliffs that had witnessed centuries of storms, while providing precarious shelter for those whose circumstances had reduced them to existence at margins, where sea met land in eternal struggle between forces too vast for human comprehension, yet intimate enough to determine daily survival through tides that brought both sustenance and destruction according to rhythms that respected no mortal claims about security or permanence. Edrin Thorne had spent 28 years learning that survival required acceptance of limitations that poverty imposed, while maintaining dignity that circumstances could not steal, if spirit remained unbroken, despite hardships that tested every assumption about justice, fairness, and the possibility of improvement through honest labor and careful stewardship of meager resources that represented a protection against disasters that could sweep away lifetime of careful accumulation in single night of natural violence. His cottage perched on outcropping that provided elevated position for observing weather patterns that determined whether fishing would prove profitable or dangerous on any given day, its humble construction reflecting skills learned through necessity rather than formal education about building techniques that required resources beyond reach of those whose survival depended entirely upon success. All negotiation with sea that gave and took according to laws that human understanding could rarely predict accurately, despite generations of accumulated experience. The fishing boat that constituted his primary tool for extracting livelihood from waters that belonged to no one, while serving everyone who possessed courage and knowledge to harvest their bounty, represented years of careful maintenance and strategic reinvestment of profits that rarely exceeded basic survival requirements, despite competence that should have warranted greater prosperity in worldwide. Merit determined reward, rather than circumstances that individual effort could not always overcome. Saltmere itself existed in liminal space between recognized settlements whose prosperity attracted governmental attention and complete abandonment that would eliminate administrative burden of providing services to population whose economic contribution remained minimal despite citizenship, that theoretically entitled residents to protection and support that resource allocation rarely extended to CE. Communities whose strategic importance seemed negligible compared to centers of commerce and political activity. The village's isolation had fostered independence that bordered on self-sufficiency, while creating vulnerability that outside assistance could not address when disasters exceeded local capacity for response and recovery. Weather remained their primary adversary, alongside economic forces that made small-scale fishing increasingly difficult, as larger operations monopolized prime territories, while regulatory changes favored established enterprises over individual operators whose traditional practices faced systematic replacement by industrial methods. But isolation also preserved customs and knowledge that more connected communities had abandoned through modernization, that prioritized efficiency over understanding of complex relationships between human activity and natural systems, whose balance required careful attention to cycles and patterns, that mechanical approaches often disrupted, despite superior immediate productivity that came at cost. Long-term sustainability. Among traditions that Saltmere maintained despite their irrelevance to contemporary commercial fishing were stories about oceanic inhabitants whose existence paralleled human civilization, while remaining hidden from surface dwellers, whose contact with such beings typically resulted in transformative experiences that challenged every assumption about reality, possibility, and the nature of intelligence. Lands that extended beyond terrestrial limitations, despite sharing fundamental characteristics of consciousness and social organization. The old fishermen who gathered at Harbor Tavern during winter months when weather prevented productive work would share tales that served as entertainment, while preserving memory of encounters that official histories ignored, despite evidence that suggested oceanic civilizations, whose sophistication exceeded anything surface cultures had achieved through technologies that worked with natural forces, rather than against them according to principles that industrial development had forgotten or deliberately rejected. Such stories typically included warnings about oceanic law that governed interaction between surface and depth-dwelling peoples through ancient agreements that recognized mutual sovereignty while establishing protocols for emergency situations where humanitarian obligation transcended political convenience but could not override cosmic justice that demanded payment for every gift received from powwow. Whose generosity came with prices that recipients might not understand until circumstances revealed true costs of oceanic intervention in mortal affairs. Tonight, as autumn storms gathered strength for assault upon coastline that had endured countless such attacks, while occasionally surrendering territory to forces beyond human resistance or negotiation. Circumstances would arrange encounter that tested whether Mercy could survive contact with laws that valued balance over individual welfare, while demanding choices that challenged every assumption. About reward and punishment, gift and burden, salvation and sentence that oceanic wisdom imposed upon those whose kindness attracted attention, from powers that measured worth, according to standards that mortal understanding could barely comprehend. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The storm struck with fury that seemed personal, transforming familiar harbor into battlefield where wind and wave contested ownership of territory that human settlement had claimed through generations of stubborn persistence, despite obvious disadvantage and struggle against forces whose power made architectural protection seem pitiful compared to oceanic determination to reclaim boundaries that tie. Terrestrial authority had never legitimately secured through conquest or negotiation. Edrin secured his boat with movements that had become automatic through years of preparation for weather that could destroy lifetime of investment in moments of violence that respected no human attempt to impose order upon chaos, that served natural laws rather than mortal convenience. The small vessel represented his livelihood and independence, its survival essential for continued existence that depended entirely upon ability to harvest marine resources during periods when weather permitted safe operation beyond protective harbor. "Going to be a bad one," he muttered while checking lines that held boat against dock, whose pilings had been driven deep into seabed through understanding that coastal construction required foundation, capable of withstanding forces that could move mountains given sufficient time and persistent application of energy that never tired despite human assumptions about permanence and security. The harbor emptied rapidly, as other fishermen completed their own preparations for storm, that forecasts suggested would exceed normal parameters for autumn weather, bringing winds and precipitation that could prove dangerous for anyone caught without adequate shelter during period when elements demonstrated their supremacy over human presumption about control and predictability. "Edrin!" Voice called through rising wind that carried sound with distortion that made identification difficult despite familiarity, suggested by informal address from someone who knew him well enough to use personal name, rather than formal courtesy that strangers typically employed during brief interactions. "Here," he responded while turning toward voice that had originated from direction of harbor mouth, where visibility decreased rapidly as spray and rain combined to create atmospheric conditions that challenged normal sensory navigation, despite improved familiarity that years of coastal living had provided through experience with weather patterns and their effects upon environmental awareness. "Help," came reply that transformed casual communication into emergency requiring immediate response, despite dangerous conditions that made assistance potentially costly for anyone willing to risk personal safety, for sake of others whose circumstances remained unknown, but whose distress demanded humanitarian consideration, regardless of practical complications that storm created for rescue attempts. Following distressed voice toward source that wind and weather made difficult to locate precisely, Edrin discovered situation that challenged every assumption about normal fishing emergency, while presenting moral choice that would affect not only immediate participants, but broader relationships between worlds, whose separation had been maintained through careful avoidance of exactly such crises. Situations. Two figures struggled against waves that had grown beyond anything normal. Storm should have produced near harbor entrance where depth and configuration typically provided protection from oceanic violence, that remained contained within deeper waters, where fishing became profitable, but dangerous for small boats during extreme weather conditions that transformed familiar environment into alien lands. "Cape." "Hold on," Edrin called, while launching boat that represented essential tool for reaching victims, whose position beyond swimming distance from shore required watercraft intervention, despite obvious danger that approaching storm surge presented for rescue attempt that could easily become multiple fatality incident if weather conditions continued deteriorating at current rate. The engine caught on second attempt despite cold that made mechanical operation unreliable, its faithful response providing hope that equipment would continue functioning long enough to complete rescue mission before conditions exceeded operational parameters that experience had established for safe boat handling during emergency situations. that required rapid response without adequate preparatio. End time. "We're coming," he announced while navigating toward figures whose struggle against currents and waves suggested exhaustion that would soon overcome whatever strength remained for maintaining position, that kept them alive while storm surge threatened to sweep them beyond range of assistance that even desperate rescue attempt could provide, given limitations of equipment and operator skill under extreme condition. As distance closed between rescuer and victims, detail became visible that challenged rational explanation while demanding immediate response, regardless of implications that supernatural circumstances might create for understanding of reality and appropriate behavior when confronted with phenomena that folklore had described, but which practical experience had never encountered directly. The struggling figures possessed characteristics that marked them as belonging to oceanic realm rather than terrestrial environment, despite their obvious distress and apparent need for assistance, that humanitarian obligation demanded regardless of species barriers that normally prevented such intimate cooperation between surface and depth-dwelling peoples, whose contact typically occurred through carefully controlled diplomatic channels rather than emergency circumstances. "Mermaids," Edrin whispered, with recognition that folklore had prepared him to acknowledge even as rational mind protested impossibility of encounter, that stories claimed happened rarely enough to remain legendary rather than historical fact, requiring practical response to immediate crisis that transcended theoretical considerations about appropriate behavior toward mythical beings. The sisters, for their similarity suggested family relationship, despite individual differences that became apparent as rescue boat approached their position, fought against waves that seemed intent upon separating them, while their obvious exhaustion indicated that time remained limited for successful intervention, before natural forces overcame whatever supernatural resilience their oceanic nature provided against environmental hazards. "Grab the line," Edrin shouted, while throwing rescue rope toward nearest figure whose golden hair and scales that caught lightning flashes marked her as elder sister, based on bearing that suggested responsibility and protective concern for companion whose distress seemed more severe despite comparable physical characteristics that indicated shared oceanic heritage and similar vulnerability to storm conditions. "Lyris!" the elder called with voice that carried oceanic harmonics, alongside immediate desperation, while struggling to maintain position that allowed assistance for sister, whose condition appeared critical despite supernatural constitution that should have provided protection against weather that affected terrestrial beings more severely than oceanic inhabitants adapted to aquatic environment. "Mireva," came response that indicated successful communication between siblings, despite circumstances that challenged normal family cooperation through individual survival instincts that storm conditions had triggered through threat to life that made personal preservation priority over mutual assistance that peaceful conditions would have permitted. "Both of you take the line." Edrin commanded with authority that emergency situation provided, despite normal deference, that surface dwellers typically demonstrated toward oceanic inhabitants, whose capabilities exceeded human limitations, while deserving respect for supernatural nature that folklore had established through warnings about appropriate behavior during unlikely encounters. "Surface dweller," Lyris observed with surprise that suggested unexpected nature of assistance being offered by terrestrial individual, whose presence in oceanic emergency seemed as unlikely as their own appearance within range of land-based rescue capability during storm that had carried them far from normal territorial boundaries that species separation maintained through mutual avoidance. "Doesn't matter right now," Edrin replied with practical focus, that reduced supernatural encounter to immediate humanitarian crisis, requiring response that transcended species barriers through recognition, that distress demanded assistance regardless of political complications that oceanic contact might create for established diplomatic protocols. "Climb aboard before storm gets worse," he instructed, while positioning boat to facilitate rescue that required careful coordination, despite dangerous conditions that made standard procedures unreliable when applied to victims whose physical characteristics differed from normal human parameters that rescue equipment had been designed to accommodate. "We cannot," Lyris protested, with voice that carried regret alongside recognition of restrictions that oceanic law imposed upon contact with surface dwellers, despite emergency circumstances that seemed to justify exception from normal prohibitions against unauthorized interaction between realms, whose separation served mutual protection through established boundaries. "You can, and you will, Edrin insisted with determination that overrode diplomatic considerations in favor of immediate preservation of life. That moral obligation demanded, regardless of legal complications that assistance might create for participants whose survival took precedence over political convenience, when humanitarian crisis demanded rapid response. Because I'm not watching anyone drown while I have means to prevent it, regardless of species, law, or consequences that helping might create for future relationships between our peoples. The declaration of principle that placed individual conscience above collective authority provided framework for action that emergency demanded, while acknowledging potential costs that compassionate choice might impose upon all participants through violation of agreements that neither surface dweller nor oceanic inhabitants could modify, without facing consequences that extended beyond personal welfare to affect broader community relationships. Looking into golden eyes that reflected depth of oceanic wisdom alongside immediate gratitude for assistance that could preserve royal lives, despite unauthorized nature of contact, that ancient laws prohibited without explicit permission from authorities whose approval remained unavailable during crisis that demanded immediate decision about priorities that balanced individual survival against collective security. Edrin understood that his choice would create consequences extending far beyond successful rescue toward implications that no amount of preparation could adequately address. The storm continued its assault upon harbor, where three beings from different worlds struggled against forces that respected no boundary between surface and depth, while testing whether compassion could overcome ancient fears that had kept their peoples separate through isolation, that served comfort more than authentic security in world, where some challenges required cooperation that traditional separation had never permitted despite obvious benefits that mutual assistance could provide when circumstances demanded shared response to common threats. The cottage interior had never seemed so small as when occupied by two oceanic princesses, whose presence transformed humble fishermen's dwelling into diplomatic territory, where worlds collided through necessity rather than choice. Their supernatural beauty, highlighting poverty, that comfortable solitude had made tolerable, until comparison revealed limitations, that isolation had concealed through artful adaptation to circumstances that could not be improved through individual effort alone. Lyris sat with regal composure, despite circumstances that had reduced oceanic royalty to dependence upon surface dwellers' hospitality, her bearing maintaining dignity, while golden eyes assessed surroundings with interest that suggested genuine appreciation for human ingenuity, despite obvious material limitations that coastal poverty imposed upon those whose survival depended entirely upon success. Full negotiation with sea that gave and took according to laws beyond mortal influence. Your kindness exceeds any obligation that emergency circumstances create, she said with formal courtesy that acknowledged debt while maintaining appropriate distance between royal personage and commoner, whose assistance had preserved lives that oceanic law considered beyond price despite surface dwellers' ignorance about political implications of rescue that challenged established protocols. Mireva moved about small space with curiosity that seemed to encompass every detail of human domestic arrangement, her examination revealing fascination with terrestrial lifestyle that formal oceanic education had never addressed through direct observation, despite theoretical study of surface civilization, that diplomatic necessity required for future rulers who might need such knowledge for negotiation purposes. Everything is so solid, she observed with wonder, that spoke of oceanic existence, where fluidity dominated environmental experience, while surface dwelling required adaptation to fixed structures that challenged assumptions about appropriate relationship between inhabitants and architectural space that serve protection rather than aesthetic harmony. Stone and wood don't shift with currents, Edrin explained with practical perspective that emphasized functional rather than artistic considerations that guided construction decisions, when resources remained limited to materials that coastal environment provided through salvage and careful harvesting of local resources, rather than imported luxury that prosperity might have permitted. But they also don't respond to inhabitant needs through adaptive configuration that oceanic architecture provides through living buildings that modify themselves, according to seasonal requirements and personal preferences expressed through harmonic communication between structure and occupant, Lyris added with educational tone that revealed sophisticated civilization whose technological approach he's transcended anything surface development had achieved. That sounds remarkable, Edrin admitted with honest appreciation for capabilities that exceeded human engineering, while recognizing that such advancement reflected different evolutionary path rather than superior intelligence, despite obvious sophistication that oceanic civilization had achieved through methods that terrestrial culture had never considered. Though I imagine it requires understanding of natural harmony that surface development abandoned when choosing mechanical solutions over organic cooperation with environmental forces, he continued with insight that surprised both sisters through recognition that surface dweller could appreciate philosophical foundations underlying oceanic technological achievements. Few surface dwellers demonstrate such understanding. Mermaid observed with approval that suggested previous assumptions about terrestrial intellectual limitations required revision, based on evidence that individual merit could transcend cultural stereotypes that limited contact between realms had fostered through ignorance, rather than actual experience with cross-cultural communication. As morning light strengthened through windows that provided clear view of harbor where Storm's passage had left debris requiring cleanup before normal fishing activities could resume, conversation continued revealing depths of mutual interest that emergency circumstances had facilitated despite diplomatic restrictions that normally prevented such intimate cultural exchange between representatives of realms whose separation served established political arrangements. "We must return before search parties locate us," Lyris announced with reluctance, that suggested personal desire for continued interaction conflicted with royal obligation that required immediate attention to political implications of unauthorized surface contact that could create complications for oceanic diplomatic relationships with surface authorities. "Search parties?" Edrin asked with concern that encompassed both immediate danger for his guests and recognition that oceanic search efforts might involve forces whose discovery of surface dweller involvement in royal rescue could create diplomatic crisis requiring explanation that circumstances had not prepared him to provide through official channels. "Father maintains constant awareness of royal locations through oceanic magic that monitors safety without restricting freedom," Mermaid explained with reference to surveillance that balanced security requirements with personal autonomy that growing princesses required for normal development, despite political importance that made their welfare paramount concern for realm security. When Storm disrupted communication, search protocols activated automatically to ensure rapid location and assistance for any emergency situation that might threaten royal safety. Lyris added with technical detail that revealed sophisticated security system whose effectiveness had been compromised by unprecedented circumstances that magical monitoring had not anticipated. "So your father knows you're missing, but not your exact location?" Edrin asked with hope that magical surveillance maintained enough imprecision to allow orderly return without immediate discovery of surface contact that could create diplomatic complications requiring explanation through official channels that neither princess seemed prepared to initiate. Magical tracking indicates general direction and approximate distance while preserving personal privacy through limitation that prevents detailed observation of individual activities, Lyris confirmed, with explanation that suggested oceanic magic respected personal autonomy while maintaining security through monitoring that balanced protection with freedom. "Though prolonged absence will trigger enhanced search efforts that could reveal specific circumstances of our rescue and current location," Mermaid added, with warning that emphasized time constraints affecting their ability to return, without creating political complications that surface contact might produce through discovery by oceanic authorities whose responsibility included managing diplomatic sea relationships. "Then we should arrange immediate return before search intensifies," Edrin concluded with practical approach that prioritized their safety over personal desire for continued interaction that had proven mutually beneficial, despite brief duration and emergency circumstances that had brought them together through humanitarian necessity rather than planned cultural exchange. "Return requires oceanic magic that proximity to sea enables through connection to elemental forces that support transformation and transportation. That distance from water gradually weakens until complete separation makes such capabilities impossible," Lyris explained with technical limitation that affected their ability to depart independently, despite supernatural capabilities that normal circumstances would permit. "How close to water do you need to be for magic to function effectively?" Edrin asked with practical concern about logistics that successful departure would require through coordination between their abilities, and his assistance in providing access to oceanic environment that restoration of power demanded. "Direct contact with natural seawater provides optimal connection, though proximity within traditional measurement distances can support limited magical function if emotional or physical stress does not interfere with concentration that complex transportation requires. Mireva answered with technical detail that suggested magical limitations that emergency circumstances could complicate despite nagging. Formal reliability. Harbor access presents no difficulty for immediate departure, Edrin assured, while considering practical arrangements for escorting royal guests to water, where they could safely resume oceanic form, and return to realm, where their absence had triggered security responses. That delay would only intensify through continued separation from normal environment. Though we must consider possibility that search efforts might have reached coastal areas where royal presence could be detected through magical resonance, that close proximity to seekers would create despite attempts to maintain concealment during transition period. Lyris observed with caution that suggested oceanic search methods, whose sophistication might detect their presence before departure, could be completed. The practical considerations had grown complex, despite apparent simplicity of returning oceanic inhabitants to natural environment, their royal status creating security complications that normal rescue would not have generated through political implications, that individual assistance could not address without understanding diplomatic framework that governed interaction between realms. Movement on the harbor, Mireva announced with sudden alertness that suggested supernatural senses detecting activity beyond normal human observation range, while her expression indicated recognition of specific characteristics that identified approaching presence as familiar, rather than unknown threat to their security. Search party? Edrin asked with growing concern about timing that seemed to preclude orderly departure in favor of discovery that could create diplomatic crisis, requiring explanation, through channels that none of them possessed authority to navigate effectively, despite good intentions that had motivated original rescue decision. Advanced scouts, Lyris confirmed, with recognition that suggested established protocols for royal search operations, whose efficiency had located them, despite magical limitations, that should have prevented such rapid discovery of specific location, where unauthorized surface contact had occurred through emergency circumstances. What happens now? Edrin asked with awareness that oceanic law might evaluate surface contact, according to standards he did not understand, while circumstances had created situation, requiring explanation that could affect relationships extending far beyond individual participants toward broader diplomatic framework that governed interaction between realms. Now, Father arrives to evaluate circumstances and determine appropriate response to situation that treaty provisions had not anticipated, despite comprehensive attempts to address emergency contact between surface dwellers and oceanic inhabitants. Lyris replied with tone that suggested complex legal framework, whose application would determine consequences for all participants. And what range of responses might such evaluation produce? He pressed with need for understanding potential outcomes that could affect his future, alongside their welfare, through decisions made according to oceanic law that operated according to principles he could not predict, despite obvious importance for his immediate survival and long-term security. Responses that range from grateful recognition of humanitarian assistance to formal charges of treaty violation depending upon evaluation of circumstances, intentions, and behavior during unauthorized contact. Mireva answered with honesty that encompassed both hope and concern about their father's judgment regarding surface dweller, whose actions had preserved royal lives despite technical viola. Tie-ins of established protocol. As harbor activity increased, with arrival of oceanic forces, whose purpose included evaluation of emergency situation that had brought royalty into contact with surface dweller, whose behavior would face scrutiny according to standards that determined whether assistance deserved recognition or punishment. Edrin prepared to learn whether compassion could survive encounter with justice that served lective security through individual assessment of character and motivation that circumstances had revealed through crisis requiring choice between personal safety and humanitarian obligation. The poor fisherman who had risked storm to save drowning strangers would soon discover whether oceanic wisdom could recognize mercy as strength rather than weakness in world, where kindness often faced opposition from those who confused compassion with dangerous naivety that threatened established order through individual conscience that challenged collective authority despite serving principles had authentic leadership should embrace rather than suppress. Chapter 3. The Sea King emerged from depths with presence that transformed harbor into throne room. where oceanic authority commanded absolute attention, despite terrestrial setting that should have limited his power through distance from natural element that sustained royal capabilities. Water itself seemed to respond to his approach as waves organized themselves into formation that spoke of conscious arrangement rather than random natural movement, creating platform that elevated his emergence while demonstrating mastery over forces that human understanding could barely comprehend. King Nerion possessed bearing that marked him as ruler, whose authority had been earned through millennia of governing oceanic realm, with wisdom that balanced individual welfare against collective necessity, while maintaining diplomatic relationships with surface world through careful adherence to treaties that prevented conflict despite fundamental differences between civilizations whose cooperate on remained essential for planetary stability. His physical presence commanded respect through combination of supernatural beauty and underlying power that suggested capabilities extending far beyond normal oceanic magic toward forces that could reshape reality according to royal will when circumstances justified such intervention, despite preferences for diplomatic solution that served mutual interests rather than imposing oceanic authority. Aru demonstration of superior strength. "Daughters," he said, with voice that carried oceanic depths alongside parental relief at finding royal heirs safe, despite unauthorized surface contact that had triggered security responses requiring personal investigation of circumstances that could affect broader relationships between realms whose peace depended upon consistent respect for established boundaries. "Father," Lyris replied with formal acknowledgement that balanced filial affection with recognition that royal protocol required appropriate deference during official evaluation of situation, that political implications had elevated beyond simple family reunion toward diplomatic incident requiring careful management through established procedures. "We are safe and unharmed," Mireva added with immediate reassurance that addressed parental concern, while providing essential information about their welfare that security assessment required, before proceeding to examination of circumstances that had brought oceanic royalty into unauthorized contact with surface dweller. "And this," King Nerion continued, while directing attention toward Edrin, with scrutiny that seemed to evaluate not only immediate character, but deeper qualities that emergency circumstances had revealed through choices made under pressure that tested authentic nature of individual moral foundation, "is the surface dweller whose actions preserved royal lives despite treaty restrictions that prohibited such contact." "Yes, Your Majesty," Edrin replied, with respectful acknowledgement that balanced recognition of oceanic authority with dignity that honest behavior had earned despite social position that placed him far below royal attention under normal circumstances that emergency had transformed into unprecedented diplomatic encounter. "My daughters inform me that your assistance exceeded requirements of humanitarian obligation while respecting oceanic dignity through behavior that demonstrated understanding of appropriate boundaries, despite crisis circumstances that could have justified less careful attention to cultural sensitivity," King Nerion observed with assessment that encompassed both specific actions and broader care. "Tur evaluation. I did what anyone should do when lives are threatened," Edrin responded with honesty that emphasized humanitarian motivation, rather than seeking recognition for behavior that moral obligation had demanded. Regardless of species barriers or political complications that assistance might create through unintended diplomatic consequences. "Indeed," the Sea King mused with expression that suggested consideration of factors extending beyond immediate rescue toward broader implications for relationships between realms whose cooperation required careful balance of individual conscience and collective security, through policies that honored both humanitarian obligation and political necessity. Though few surface dwellers would risk personal safety for oceanic inhabitants, whose presence typically inspires fear rather than compassion among land-dwelling populations, whose understanding of our people remains limited to folklore that emphasizes danger rather than acknowledging shared values that connect all conscious beings. "Fear serves ignorance more than wisdom," Edrin replied, with perspective that surprised royal attention, through recognition that surface dweller possessed understanding of prejudice that careful observation had revealed, despite limited exposure to oceanic civilization, through cultural isolation that most coastal communities maintained. "Wisdom that suggests character deserving of recognition," King Nerion acknowledged with approval, that encompassed both individual merit and potential value for broader diplomatic purposes, that such understanding could serve through cross-cultural communication, requiring authentic appreciation for different perspectives, rather than mere tolerance based on political convenience. Though recognition of character must be balanced against treaty obligations that maintain peaceful separation between our realms, through clearly defined boundaries that unauthorized contact threatens to compromise regardless of humanitarian motivations that inspire such interaction. He continued with reference to legal framework, that individual merit could not override without careful considero. Tie-in of precedent. Therefore, the Sea King announced with decision that would transform rescue from simple humanitarian gesture into catalyst for diplomatic revolution that challenged established assumptions about relationship between surface and oceanic civilizations. Circumstances require formal evaluation through oceanic law that addresses both emergency provisions and broader implications for realm security. Formal evaluation, Edrin repeated with concern about legal process that operated according to principles he did not understand, while recognizing that oceanic justice would determine his fate through standards that might not recognize surface legal concepts or individual rights that terrestrial law considered fundamental for fair assessment of circumstances. Evaluation that considers not only immediate actions during emergency, but character demonstrated through behavior that reveals authentic nature of individual moral foundation. King Nerion explained with framework that encompassed broader assessment than simple fact-finding mission about treaty compliance during crisis situation. And what form would such evaluation take? Lyris asked with obvious concern for surface dweller, whose assistance had preserved royal lives while placing him at risk of punishment that oceanic law might impose for violations that emergency circumstances had forced upon someone whose ignorance of treaty terms could not excuse behavior that political necessity required evaluation, despite humanitarian motivations. Evaluation that requires extended observation of character under controlled circumstances that reveal true nature of individual moral choices when freed from immediate crisis pressure that could influence behavior toward temporary cooperation rather than authentic commitment to principles that sustainable relationships require. The Sea King replied, with explanation that suggested comprehensive assessment rather than simple judicial proceeding. Extended observation conducted where and under what conditions? Mireva pressed with awareness that oceanic evaluation methods might impose requirements that surface dweller could not survive, despite supernatural capabilities that oceanic environment would provide through magical support that extended terrestrial limitations. Observation conducted within oceanic realm, where character assessment can proceed according to established protocols, while magical protection ensures surface dweller survival during evaluation period that requires immersion in environment that reveals authentic response to oceanic civilization and its values. King Nerion answered with technical detail about process that addressed practical conc. Earns while maintaining legal requirements. Though such observation serves dual purpose through opportunity for cultural exchange that could benefit both individual participants and broader diplomatic relationships if evaluation reveals character deserving of enhanced cooperation between realms, whose separation has perhaps outlived its original justification. He added with suggestion that rescue might catalyze broader evolution in inter-realm relationships. I accept such evaluation, Edrin declared with courage, that demonstrated commitment to seeing consequences of compassionate choice, through to conclusion, regardless of personal risk that oceanic justice might impose through assessment that could prove beneficial or catastrophic, depending upon standards that remained unknown, despite obvious importance for his future. Though I request understanding that my knowledge of oceanic culture and appropriate behavior remains limited to emergency circumstances that provided no opportunity for proper education about customs and expectations, that evaluation will presumably assess according to standards that formal preparation should address, he added with practical concern about fairness. Cultural education forms essential component of evaluation process, King Nerion assured with recognition that fair assessment required adequate preparation, despite circumstances that had prevented normal diplomatic protocol from providing appropriate background for cross-cultural interaction that evaluation would necessarily involve. Furthermore, he continued with announcement that would transform evaluation from simple character assessment into unprecedented opportunity for diplomatic innovation that could reshape relationships between civilizations whose cooperation remained essential despite historical separation. Evaluation will include specific tests that addresses broader questions about surface dweller suitability for enhanced cooperation that both realms could benefit from through mutual understanding. What specific test would such evaluation involve? Edrin asked with awareness that oceanic assessment might require demonstration of capabilities or commitment that individual merit could not guarantee, despite authentic desire for positive outcome that served both personal welfare and broader diplomatic purposes. Test that addresses fundamental questions about loyalty, wisdom, and capacity for choice that serves justice rather than convenience when circumstances force decision between personal preference and collective welfare. The Sea King replied with explanation that suggested evaluation would challenge every assumption about individual autonomy versus social obligation. Specifically, King Nerion announced with decision that would transform character assessment into choice, that challenged every assumption about reward and punishment, gift and burden, salvation and sentence, that oceanic wisdom imposed upon those whose kindness had attracted attention from powers that measured worth, according to standards that mortal understanding could barely comprehend. Yuma, since choose one daughter to bind to yourself through formal union that serves diplomatic alliance while addressing succession requirements that oceanic law demands for royal marriages. The announcement sent shock through assembled participants as implications began penetrating understanding of consequences that simple rescue had created through transformation of humanitarian assistance into catalyst for political revolution that challenged established assumptions about appropriate relationships between surface and oceanic civilizations through choice that would affect not only immediate participants but broader framework of inter-realm cooperation. Choose? Edrin repeated with horror at requirement that transformed gratitude into cruelty through forced decision that would fracture family relationship while binding him to responsibility he had never sought, despite appreciation for honor that such alliance theoretically represented according to diplomatic standards he did not understand or desire. Ancient law requires balance for royal debt that cannot be repaid through normal means. King Nerion explained with reference to legal framework that individual preference could not modify despite obvious emotional cost, that such requirement imposed upon all participants through cosmic justice that valued stability over personal happiness when collective security demanded sacrifice. Choice between Lyris, whose wisdom and dedication qualify her for shared leadership, that alliance would provide through combination of oceanic authority and surface understanding, or Mireva, whose curiosity about terrestrial civilization could serve expanded cooperation through cultural bridge that her enthusiasm would create for broader diplomatic purposes. Looking toward both sisters whose expressions revealed complex mixture of duty and personal desire, political necessity and individual preference, Edrin understood that his rescue had created consequences that challenged every assumption about reward and punishment, while forcing choice that would determine not only his own future, but broader relationships between worlds whose cooperation require sacrifice that challenged individual happiness for collective welfare. The poor fisherman who had saved drowning strangers without thought of reward now faced decision that would reshape his entire existence while affecting oceanic succession and diplomatic relationships between realms, whose future might depend upon choice that no amount of wisdom could make, without causing pain, that love made inevitable when duty demanded separation of those who belonged together, despite political necessity that required individual sacrifice for collective benefit. 1 year later, the Coral Palace had become home in ways that Edrin's humble cottage never could have prepared him to understand, its living architecture responding to inhabitant needs through harmonic resonance that created comfort beyond anything terrestrial construction could achieve, despite magnificent beauty that oceanic craftsmanship had perfected through millennia of artistic development guided by aesthetic principles that celebrated natural harmony rather than imposing geometric authority upon organic environment. His chambers overlooked gardens where crystalline formations channeled light into patterns that shifted throughout oceanic day cycles, creating ambiance that supported contemplation while providing private space for reflection about choices that had transformed simple fishermen into diplomatic liaison, whose responsibilities extended far beyond personal welfare toward broader relationships between civilizations whose cooperation required careful cultivation through individual commitment to principles that served collective benefit. The morning briefing includes reports from Northern Current territories about fishing agreements that coastal communities have requested through official channels rather than informal negotiation that previously characterized such arrangements, Mireva announced while reviewing documentation that diplomatic office required for coordinating expanded cooperation between surface and oceanic populate ions whose interaction had increased dramatically following royal marriage that formalized alliance. Her position as cultural ambassador had evolved beyond ceremonial duties toward practical responsibility for managing cross-cultural communication that enhanced cooperation required through understanding of different perspectives that genuine partnership demanded despite complexity that such relationships created for established administrative procedures, that individual creativity often needed to modify for effective implementation. Surface dwellers have adapted to formal protocol more readily than oceanic predictions suggested they would. She continued with observation that challenged assumptions about terrestrial flexibility regarding bureaucratic requirements that diplomatic relationship required through recognition, that mutual benefit justified administrative complexity when results demonstrated improved outcomes for all participants. Perhaps because they recognized genuine opportunity for improvement rather than merely tolerating imposed obligations, Edrin suggested, with perspective that experience had provided through observation of coastal communities whose enthusiasm for expanded cooperation exceeded official expectations, despite initial suspicion that major policy changes typically generated among populations whose experience suggested that governmental innovation often served elite interests rather than addressing practical concerns. Morning reports also include confirmation that Eastern Reef territories have approved expanded cultural exchange programs that allow surface dwellers to experience oceanic environment through magical life support, while oceanic inhabitants visit coastal communities under protective enchantments that maintain their health during terrestrial exposure, Mireva added, with reference to innovations the SAL T-Marriage Alliance had facilitated through demonstration that cross-cultural relationships could succeed when supported by appropriate magical and administrative infrastructure. Lyris mentioned that participation applications exceed available positions by factors that suggest genuine interest rather than mere curiosity about exotic experiences. Edrin noted with satisfaction that programs designed to foster understanding had attracted serious participants whose commitment to learning indicated potential for sustained cooperation beyond experimental phase that initial implementation had necessarily required. Sister has become remarkably effective as diplomatic coordinator, Mireva observed with pride that encompassed both family affection and professional respect for administrative capabilities, that formal training had developed through practical experience with complex negotiations requiring balance of competing interests while maintaining focus on mutual benefit that authentic partnership demanded. Her marriage to Captain Thalaris has provided stability that allows her to focus on diplomatic responsibilities while maintaining oceanic connections that political position requires. She continued with reference to union that had resolved succession concerns while creating partnership that served both personal fulfillment and professional effectiveness through complementary capabilities that enhanced royal service. Though I suspect she finds administrative challenges more engaging than ceremonial duties that traditional royal role would have emphasized, Edrin replied, with understanding that had developed through observation of Lyris's obvious satisfaction with work that utilized analytical capabilities while serving diplomatic purposes that matched her commitment to improved relationships between realms. As do I, Mireva agreed, with reference to her own position, that combined official responsibility with personal interest in cultural exploration, that formal duties encouraged, rather than constraining, through recognition, that effective diplomacy required authentic enthusiasm for cross-cultural understanding rather than mere performance of assigned tasks. Speaking of duties, she continued with transition toward discussion of immediate responsibilities that daily schedule required attention, to despite broader satisfaction with life that circumstances had created through transformation of emergency rescue into foundation for relationship that served both personal happiness and collective welfare. Father requests your presence at this afternoon's council meeting to discuss territorial expansion of coastal cooperation agreements. Territorial expansion? Edrin asked with interest in developments that suggested continued evolution of inter-realm relationships toward increased integration that could benefit both populations through expanded economic cooperation, alongside cultural exchange that established programs had demonstrated successful despite initial concerns about compatibility between different civilizations. Southern coastal communities have requested formal alliance status that would provide oceanic protection for their fishing fleets in exchange for guaranteed territorial access to traditional oceanic hunting grounds that surface development has begun restricting through industrial expansion that threatens traditional resource management, Mireva explained, with reference to complex negotiations requiring careful balance of environmental protection and economic development. Council evaluation will determine whether such arrangements serve oceanic interests, while providing sufficient benefit for surface communities. That commitment would prove sustainable, despite pressure that industrial interests might apply through political influence that individual communities often cannot resist without external support. She added, with acknowledgement of practical challenges the idealistic cooperation often faced when confronted with established economic forces. The precedent such agreements could establish might encourage other coastal regions to seek similar arrangements. Edrin observed with appreciation for potential that successful implementation could create for broader transformation of relationships between surface and oceanic populations, whose mutual benefit required institutional framework that individual goodwill alone could not sustain. Precisely Father's concern, Mireva confirmed with recognition that royal perspective necessarily encompassed broader implications than immediate circumstances might suggest, despite obvious advantages that expanded cooperation could provide for all participants when properly structured through careful attention to long-term sustainability rather than short-term convenience. Though your perspective as someone who understands both surface practical concerns and oceanic capabilities provides valuable insight for evaluation that purely oceanic analysis might miss, despite comprehensive understanding of aquatic factors that such decisions require. She added with appreciation for cross-cultural perspective that his background provided for diplomatic analysis. Experience that marriage has enhanced through exposure to oceanic governance principles that terrestrial education never addressed. Edrin acknowledged with gratitude for opportunities that alliance had provided for understanding complex systems, that effective cooperation required appreciation of despite fundamental differences in approach and underlying assumptions about appropriate relationship between authority and individual autonomy. Marriage that has provided more than political alliance, Mireva said with personal warmth, that encompassed both diplomatic satisfaction and emotional fulfillment that their relationship had achieved through combination of genuine affection and shared commitment to principles that sustained partnership, despite challenges that cross-cultural union necessarily created through different backgrounds and perspectives. Partnership that demonstrates authentic love can transcend species barriers while serving collective welfare, he replied, with recognition that their relationship had achieved balance between personal happiness and public responsibility that skeptics had claimed impossible, despite obvious potential, that mutual respect could create when supported by institutional framework that honored both individual autonomy and collective necessity. This evening's celebration commemorates first anniversary of alliance while acknowledging expansion that continued cooperation has achieved, Mireva announced with reference to formal recognition that success deserved, despite ongoing challenges that sustained effort required for maintaining relationships. That complexity made vulnerable to misunderstanding despite fundamental compatibility that faith had established. Anniversary that marks beginning, rather than completion of transformation, that both realms continue experiencing through expanded contact that challenges traditional assumptions while creating opportunities that isolation had never permitted. Edrin observed with perspective that encompassed both satisfaction with progress and awareness of continued potential that future cooperation could realize. Through sustained commitment to principles that initial success had demonstrated effective. Beginning that your compassion made possible despite storm that threatened to separate worlds that cooperation has proven benefit both. Mireva agreed, with recognition that humanitarian choice had catalyzed broader transformation, whose ultimate implications remained unknown, despite obvious improvement that initial changes had created for all participants. Storm that brought us together while testing whether mercy could survive contact with justice that demanded balance, but ultimately recognized love as foundation for authentic cooperation between peoples whose separation had served fear rather than wisdom. He replied with understanding that experience had provided about relationship between individual conscience and collective welfare, when both served principles that honored dignity of all conscious beings. The poor fisherman who had risked storm to save drowning strangers had discovered that compassion attracted attention from powers whose justice demanded choice, that challenged every assumption about reward and punishment, while ultimately creating opportunity for transformation that served both personal fulfillment and broader welfare through recognition that authentic love could overcome ancient barriers when supported by wisdom that honored both individual autonomy and collective responsibility for mutual flourishing. As afternoon light filtered through crystalline windows that transformed oceanic chamber into sanctuary, where surface dweller and oceanic princess planned continued service to alliance that their marriage represented, Edrin understood that his choice had created consequences that extended far beyond individual happiness toward demonstration, that mercy remained stronger than fear when circumstance demanded courage to honor what love revealed about authentic relationship between beings whose differences enriched rather than threatened mutual understanding. The decision that had seemed impossible when first presented, choosing between sisters whose individual worth made selection seem cruel regardless of outcome, had resolved through recognition that love created its own wisdom when guided by commitment to serving what honored all participants rather than mere personal preference, revealing that oceanic justice sought harmony rather than punishment. Why? An authentic character demonstrated worthiness for trust that transformation required. Their story would inspire future cooperation between realms whose citizens learned that kindness attracted reward rather than punishment when offered without expectation of return, while demonstrating that ancient barriers could dissolve when replaced by relationships that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare through recognition that authentic strength served protection of others rather than domination over them. In waters that connected all shores despite surface barriers that ignorance maintained, compassion had proven itself capable of reshaping destiny when offered freely to those whose need transcended species difference, creating foundation for peace that would endure as long as individuals remembered that mercy remained choice, available to any heart willing to risk everything for sake of preserving life that belonged to someone else. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.